Alright, welcome back to the third video in our tutorial series. This one covers my least favorite part of the quilt process, but probably the most important part. This one covers marking out the whole pattern on your top quilt and measuring everything out. So what I like to do is just lay this fabric out on the floor and actually tape it down at all the corners and in the middle just to hold it flat so that it doesn't flop everywhere around. If you're kind of a more experienced sewer and you work with a lot of other fabrics other than backpacking material, you might think this is a little silly, but it really does help with these thinner material. I mean, this is 0.66 ounces per square yard, so it's pretty thin. So I just like this. It keeps it all together in place. And then what I also do is put down my measuring tape along the whole length here. And that's just so I can really easily measure it all out and mark it. And then I'll just go through with my tape measure here, kind of as the straight edge for that horizontal line, and I'll just trace it out. And what you're going to want to get to trace out the lines is actually a pencil like this. This is a water-soluble marking pencil for fabric. So you can make all your marks with this, and then it comes right off with water when you're done. So I'll go ahead and get started on this, and hopefully the time lapse works out. And 1 minute later, I have all my lines marked. So I'm not sure if you can see them very well here, but I have all of my horizontal lines going down the side here. You want to make these as dark as you can get them, because right now they're still kind of hard to see, and then it's going to be a lot harder to see them when you're sewing your baffles in. So there's a couple things I forgot to mention at the start of this video. They're very important. Number one, we're making all these markings on the inside of the fabric. That's the shiny side, the calendared side. The non-shiny side is what you want on the outside. You want to make these on the inside so that when you're sewing your baffles in, you can actually see those lines. So you'll be absolutely screwed if you make these on the outside. The other thing you want to make sure you're doing is that you're leaving your seam allowance. For obvious reasons. If you don't leave that, you won't be able to sew it to the dimensions you want. But that's pretty much it. It does take a while, but the more time you spend here, the less painful it's going to be when you go to sew it all. So the other thing you might notice is I only marked the largest outside width. I didn't do anything with a taper yet. That's just because the taper gets really difficult to do when you're going with differential cuts. My plan with this quilt is to actually pin it all together at the end after I have all of both shells cut out, so that I can see exactly where it lines up and then cut that taper, rather than trying to judge it based on the length dimensions here, because that's something I messed up on my last quilt, and try not to make that mistake again this time. But overall, not too bad. This is kind of the most boring part, but once you get it done, and if you do it right, it definitely pays off in the end. Okay, so we have the outer shell laid out now, so we're going to go ahead and mark down those baffles. I just wanted to go over this first baffle section with you, just because it is a little tricky. Since we're doing this outer cut, you have to measure out actually the first baffle height and then the normal baffle width. So you can see here I've got my seam allowance here from 1 inch there, and then I have 2.25 measured out because that's the height of the baffle material we're using, and then I have added onto that the normal baffle width of 5.8 here. So that part's pretty tricky. And then one more thing to let you know about, which I should have gone over at the beginning. When you're measuring everything out, you want to go ahead and do the math ahead of time in your Excel spreadsheet here. Just because if you measure out 5.8 and then measure 5.8 again from the line you just made, when you get to the end, you're going to be, way off. So what you want to do is do your math ahead of time, figure out what part on your measuring tape each dash is actually going to be at, and then mark it at, so like this one's 10.1, the next one's going to be down here at 15.9. That way you know when you get to the end, your length's actually going to be right. So I'll go ahead and finish up these markings. Okay, so the next step after you've cut out both your shells is to pin it together here at all of the baffle lines. So what you're looking at here is the inside of the outer shell. I just laid it on top and pinned it together at the baffles. My plan here is to flip it over to the other side and then mark out where my shoulders, hips, and feet line up, and then from there I can measure it out to the width dimensions and cut the taper from there. It's really hard to do it when they're separated because the outer shell is so much longer, so it's easier to just put it together and cut it that way. Okay, so this one's going to be pretty hard to see, but after I flipped it over, I pretty much laid down and marked out where my hips and my shoulders are. So up here, the shoulders ended up being about 9 inches from the top of the fabric, and then my hips ended up being about 33 inches from the top. And then for the foot box, I pretty much just measured 25 feet from the bottom, just because I know the zipper is 24 feet, and then I added a little extra because of that seam allowance at the bottom. A little word of caution here: when you're making out the marks, make sure that you remember the seam allowances and you don't just put it right at the line. It's really easy to make that mistake, so make sure you're doing that. I pretty much just did a straight taper from the foot box down here to the hip mark, and then at the top there isn't too much of a taper going from the hips to the shoulders. The shoulder mark is going to be right here at the overall width, and then I just brought it back in a little bit up at the shoulders just so it cinches around my neck really well. Another thing to remember is that when you're making the widths, remember that you only have to subtract half of the difference. So for the feet down here, the total width is 40 inches, and at the hips it's 45, so that's only a 2.5 inch difference on each side. That's another tricky part. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out, trying to hold it as closely as I can at the baffles, and hopefully it goes well. Well, that got a little dicey there for a minute, but it more or less looks like a quilt shape now. And I'm sure these edges will clean themselves up as I'm going through and sewing them together. So I guess the only words of advice I have are make sure you hold the edges together as best as you can and just kind of go for it. And yeah, just don't mess with it in the vertical length, because since that other shell is supposed to be longer, it kind of messes up the whole thing if you try and pull it down that way, which is easy to do. And then just remember that you can always cut more off later, but you can't add material back. So just take your time and do it right. I'm pretty happy with the way this one turned out, and it should sew up fine. And the last two steps here are cutting out your baffle material and the draft tubes. So what I'm doing for the baffle material, the easiest way to cut this out is just to neatly fold your netting as neatly as you can, and then cut it off the end like this. So I'm doing 2¼ inch baffles, so I'm going to cut these at about 3½ inches right here just to be safe, and then just proceed down the whole line like that. So that'll give you nice clean, in my case 2-yard baffle sections to work with. And then the last step here is to cut out your 2 draft tubes for the top and the bottom. I cut mine out 8 inches wide, so I figure 6 inches for the baffle tube material will give me 2 inches up and then 2 inches across, and then just a little extra for seam allowances. So that's pretty much it for cutting everything out. The next step is getting to sewing. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully you all feel a little bit better about marking out your pattern and cutting that taper. So if you like what we're doing, check us out on loosegoosedownsupply.com and on our Instagram page. And make sure you like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We'll be starting actually sewing in the baffles and assembling the quilt, so we're getting to the fun part. So thanks again for watching.